Hello, I'm Halise Lieberman, Director of the Toby Center for Jewish Life and Learning, and I'm very happy to welcome you to today's pre-Purim TJHTalks session. We're delighted to see so many familiar names among the participants, and for those of you who are with us for the first time, we extend a very warm welcome. We are joined by our supporters, members of the Toby Center's Scholarly Advisory Council, academic and institutional colleagues, and representatives from our partner organizations here in Poland and around the world. The conversation, or spiel, if you like, will last approximately 45 minutes and will be followed by a brief Q&A session. If you would like to ask a question, please do so in the chat box. We'd also be very happy to know from where you are joining us, so please let us know in the comments. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Ann Toback, CEO of the Workers' Circle.
Hi, welcome.
I had the opportunity of touring Jewish Lithuania and Poland with Ann and Workers' Circle groups several times. We explored together shared histories, roots, and recipes, and of course, vodka and local liqueurs. We're looking forward to hosting the next Workers' Circle group, among others, in 2020. And without further ado, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Halise, and I want to thank the Toby Center for the renewal of Jewish life and learning. It is so wonderful to be back, even via the internet, to talk about our cultural heritage in Poland, Lithuania, in the Pale of Jewish settlement, the Kingdom of Poland. I couldn't be more excited by this topic, particularly on the verge of Purim, when liquor features so heavily in our celebrations. So much of our Eastern European heritage has really helped me to make meaningful connections and grow my own Jewish identity through my connection to the Toby Center, through my connection to visiting Poland and Lithuania, through books, and through the Polin Museum of the History of the Jewish People. Really, our heritage for me is a treasure trove. It's one that keeps unpacking a history of Jewish life, culture, celebration, loss, and finding pieces of who we are. And the more I learn, and I think the more we all learn, the more robust and rich our Jewish heritage, our Jewish identity is, and the more inspiration we have into how we live our day-to-day life and how much of our lives are impacted by who we are and where we come from. So without further ado, let me talk a little bit about how I came to be so interested and excited by the topic of Jews and liquor in the Pale of Jewish settlement in the Kingdom of Poland, and introduce our two professors. I learned this in so many ways when I take on projects. I start thinking, could there be a connection? Could there be a connection to my Polish heritage? My roots are in Poland and the Ukraine. And I started brewing my own liqueur. Here, I brought a bottle, and I have a little glass for a l'chaim. And I thought, this is a fun hobby, but could there be a Jewish connection? And I started doing some research and learned that, yes, in fact, there are many connections. In fact, the manufacture and sale of liquor in the Pale of Settlement was a critical part of our Jewish heritage. And I've already seen so many of you online saying, I have an ancestor who I believe had a tavern. And that's what we're going to learn about today. And I've explored the Polin Museum of the Jewish People, and I couldn't recommend more highly that you join a trip with our friends at Toby, be it with the Workers' Circle, my group, or with others in 2022, and really experience the life where it all happened. There is nothing as close as connecting to that life and through the polling museum, and literally walking in the footsteps of our ancestors. So today is about that exploration and saying a l'chaim and celebrating a very meaningful history. And I encourage you, as you go about your daily life, to ask these questions. How does this connect to where we come from? And how does this make us who we are? So let me introduce our two professors who are going to be talking to us about this rich and very important history of our Jewish heritage and liquor. And at the end of this, you'll all be receiving resources in an email, which will include, of course, my own journey and my recipe for liqueur, and some really important writings by our two guests. The first person I'm going to introduce is Dr. Glenn Dynner. He's a professor and chair of the religion department at Sarah Lawrence College and a 2019-2020 Guggenheim Fellow. He is the author of Yankel's Tavern, Jews, Liquor, and Life in the Kingdom of Poland. And I want to hold it up. It is something I read regularly and just learn so much about Jewish life and the manufacture of liquor in the Kingdom of Poland. It's published by Oxford University Press. And this is also Glenn's second time in one of these Toby talks, so we're welcoming him back. Dr. Adam Teller is a professor of history and Judaic studies at Brown University in the United States and has written widely on the economic, social, and cultural history of the Jews in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. His most recent book, Rescue the Surviving Souls, The Great Jewish Refugee Crisis of the 17th Century, was published last year by Princeton University Press and was a finalist for the 2020 National Jewish Book Award in History. Professor Teller also serves on the academic advisory councils of both the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw and the Pinkasim Project at the National Library of Israel. And as I was saying, when you have the opportunity to visit Warsaw, a trip to the Polin Museum is necessary and really highlighted in the Tavern section of the museum, which really literally takes you in to the tavern and a center point of Jewish life. So welcome to both Adam and Glenn, and we're going to start this conversation, or this spiel, more appropriately, since it's Purim, by talking about Jewish attitudes towards drinking, and also talking a bit about this idea of Jewish sobriety. So I'll start with Glenn.
Okay, and thank you so much, Adam. Great to be with you. And thanks to the Toby Center for sponsoring this. The issue of Jews and drinking is very complicated because we have this notion of Jewish sobriety. And maybe around Purim, we don't quite abide by it, but there's that general sense that Jews don't drink. And I think Anne's whole side occupation here is one indication that might not be entirely true. I would say in Poland, though, Jews drank at a higher level than they do now. And at the same time, it was very important that Jews maintain an image of sobriety, meaning that in order to obtain the very lucrative leases on taverns and distilleries that were owned by the nobility and frequented by the local peasantry, Jews had to have this reputation for sobriety. And if we could show the first slide, Jakob. The first slide I'd like to show is actually from the cover of my book, and it's an image of a Jewish tavern keeper. Let's see if we can get that up here. There we go. Other slide. So what we're about to see is a late 19th century depiction of a Jewish tavern keeper. And just to say a few things about this. Yeah, there we go. So the artist is a non-Jewish Polish artist, really turn of 20th century. And he's depicting a semi kind of mythical image of the Jew as tavern keeper. You can see he's wearing his tallis, which may not be totally accurate. But the main thing to get across here is that he's serving the liquor, another Jew is providing the music, and the peasantry, it seems to be a Christian holiday, is celebrating the tavern and probably imbibing. And this is not just a late sort of depiction in line with Polish folk culture as nationalism began to take form, but it's also available, if we could see the next image, in a much earlier depiction from 1818, we see the same division of labor, where the Jews to the left are playing the music, the Jews to the right are serving the liquor, and it's really the non-Jewish peasantry that is enjoying it. Now, this requires a degree of sobriety. Otherwise, you drink up all your profits. And probably helps to be sober if you're calculating all the accrued drinking debts and everything else. At the same time, you're also being required to kind of serve as a center of village life as the Jewish tavern keeper. This is a really robust drinking culture, especially in the countryside. Any wedding, funeral, other kinds of ceremonies, Christian holidays would begin in the church with a very pious and probably formal service. But then there'd be a mass migration to the tavern to celebrate, where the newlywed couple would be met by the sort of anti-priest, the Jewish tavern keeper, who would toast the new couple, and then the music would strike up and everyone started singing, dancing, and drinking. And the Jewish tavern keeper inevitably seemed to remain suspiciously sober. This is depicted in the next image. This is not meant as a compliment. The Jewish tavern keeper is sober in a kind of sinister way. He's unconcerned as this peasant is passed out on the barroom floor. The others are concerned. You can see they're all looking at him. But the Jewish tavern keeper is depicted as really unconcerned and a little bit satanic even. And towards the late 19th century, this really became a trope, not just in anti-Semitic literature, but also in the literature of reformers. Social reformers felt like if you remove the Jewish tavern keeper, then you remove the widespread drinking problems. Now, it's a shame because Grabowski, the artist, actually has some very benign depictions of Jewish life as well, and of Hasidic life, but this is one of the more sinister ones, and unfortunately it became rather iconic. Now, here's why the whole thing is a bit of a myth. If we could see the next slide, please. This is all happening at a time when Hasidism is becoming a mass movement. And Hasidism arguably represents the most robust drinking culture in Jewish history. Alcohol is seen as one among several means of obtaining ecstasy and a state of holiness, a state of communion with God. And so there's a lot more permission to imbibe alcohol in the Hasidic communities, with one major difference, I would say, and that is that it's regimented. The Hasidic drinking happens around holidays, Sabbaths, certain times. You offer toasts, usually for a sacred purpose. And also, I would say, the spaces in which it occurs. One reason why, even throughout the rise of Hasidism, Jews are able to maintain this image of sobriety is because they're discreet. While non-Jews are drinking out in the open in the tavern, in the clear view of the rival culture, the Jews, you have Hasidic Jews really tending to restrict their drinking to Hasidic spaces, the shtetl, the prayer house, the Rebbe's court. And so it's able to be kept out of the public eye, and you can sustain this notion of Jewish sobriety even throughout the rise of Hasidism. And that seems to be a bit of a solution to the puzzle. But I just want to say one more thing, and that is that even with all this drinking, what today we call alcoholism doesn't appear to have been much of a problem in Jewish society. You just don't have the temperance movements, for example, that you have in non-Jewish society. If you read sermons, Hasidic and non-Hasidic rabbis are not really railing against widespread drunkenness. the way that the priests are in their sermons throughout Poland. You have to unmute.
Oh, I apologize. Thank you. Glenn, one follow-up. Is part of the reason that drunkenness was not a problem in this period that the consequences to the Jewish public of being publicly intoxicated were much more serious than to non-Jews?
Okay, that's fair enough. You know, I think being a merchant requires a certain degree of temperance, and there may be even sort of cultural stigmas against drinking. But what I said in the beginning, I think, is the most pressing reason. That is, you know, the reason why Jews are being awarded the leases on these very lucrative taverns and distilleries is because the nobility really believes that only Jews will stay sober and not drink up the entire product, that only Jews are reliable. And that's to the extent that even, as we'll talk about in a little bit, when the government starts cracking down on Jewish tavern keepers as a result of an attempt to reform drunkenness, and they outlaw Jewish tavern keeping, the nobility is very reluctant to give up their Jewish tavern keepers. They really do. They'll say it in interrogations and in legal proceedings. They'll say, only Jews are reliable and sober, and only Jews can be entrusted with running a tavern. And so they really do believe this, and I think Jews have a very strong interest in keeping up that image.
Adam, do you have more to add to our idea of Jewish attitudes toward drinking?
I think so. I study, first of all, I want to thank the Toby Center and Hilly's for inviting me to come. It is a real pleasure. And thank you, Anne, for your introduction. And Glenn and I are old friends, so it's always great to have a conversation with him. I work on a slightly earlier period from Glenn, where the issues are somewhat different. And what I was going to say is, in my period, having a drink, there was no stigma attached. Jews loved a drink. They had a drink. I've got lots of examples. Perhaps the best one is the memoirist Solomon Maimon, who grew up in a tavern in Lithuania. And he wrote, whenever a Jew passed through our village, which happened quite often, he had to stop at my grandfather's inn, where someone would come out to greet him with a glass of brandy, presumably vodka, making a sign of welcome with one hand and giving him the glass with the other. Right? And clearly the tavern keeper was doing something absolutely natural. He wanted to sell alcohol to the visitor, and the visitor was doing something absolutely natural. He'd come to a tavern, he wanted to drink. There isn't a stigma attached to drinking as such. I'm sure that comes along with in Glenn's period, or perhaps even the end of my period, where the situation about drinking changes in Poland. But in the early period, you just drank. I have other examples on Shabbat. In some taverns, you could only give alcohol on Shabbat to Jews, because they knew how to buy, you didn't have to break Shabbat to supply them with alcohol, which meant that the Jews were going into the tavern, getting alcohol to take home for Shabbat. Where was it a problem in my period? It wasn't the alcohol, it was the taverns. Jakob, can you put my first picture up? No, keep going. Go backward, number 1. That's it, thank you. Right, as far as the rabbis were concerned, taverns were dens of iniquity. If it was a big tavern like this, and I've got one rabbi called Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kaidenova, talks about these as whorehouses or taverns for goyim, where they can dance and leap and guzzle and swill, as we see for our sins. And so Jews being engaged in that kind of activity was not seen as anything very positive. Also, tavern keepers, particularly in the villages, were seen as ignoramuses, uneducated. They didn't know how to keep Shabbat. There were all kinds of stories about tavern keepers collecting money on Shabbat by putting a handkerchief in their hand and taking the money that way, or other things. So where the problem came was not having a drink. You could have a drink, but it came if you were selling alcohol in these places which were not viewed terribly positively.
Adam, if I could just interrupt, Can you redefine the time period you're looking at right now, you're talking about?
I'm talking about the 1600 to about 1800.
Thank you.
There is evidence that rabbis didn't like drinking. I've got evidence, but it's not about men, oddly enough, it's about women. In the ethical tract Brandspiegel, the author has a go at women who go to pubs to drink. He says he criticizes women who run to the pub all the time for wine and beer and games, which is presumably gambling of some sort. And he goes on to say, why is it no good? Because they sit around and gossip. They're rude about their husbands, right? And they go home and they can't do their housework, right? Because they are in a bad way. Now, I wouldn't take that literally in the sense that Jewish women went out and got drunk all the time. But it does suggest to me that having a drink was something quite natural and that Jews like to do it. I think Glenn is absolutely right. The issue was not having a drink. The issue was not drinking to excess. Right? So you see that in the pictures you can see in this tavern here. It's not the Jews who are drinking to excess. It's the non-Jews. And that colors attitudes towards alcohol, because towards the end of the 18th century in Poland, there's a genuine problem of alcoholism in the Polish population. And the Jews are selling the alcohol as tavern keepers to the Polish population. And I think that's the moment where the things that Glenn was talking about begin to come together. And this question of having to really emphasize sobriety becomes much more important. I think I'll leave it there.
Can I just add one thing? And I think one thing we have to come to terms with too is there's a certain sense of cultural superiority in claiming that you're sober, but the dominant culture is, drunken and also violent, unpredictable. And so we may also be seeing a kind of an attempt by a minority to maintain a sense of, you could say, collective self-esteem. We don't drink like they do, that kind of thing. And that feeds into the image, and that probably feeds into behavior as well a little bit.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. I'm sure that's right. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you to just talk a little bit more about when Jews started having a dominant role in taverns, in running them, who owned them, and what was its beginning?
Okay, so I'll start from the beginning, and then Glenn will pick up the story in the middle. So the beginning is that when the Jews came to Poland and their civilization began to flourish, it was a time at which the nobility were getting stronger and the king was getting weaker. And in order to survive and make money, the Jews needed to do business with the noblemen, particularly the very wealthy noblemen who were called magnates. And in order to do this, there were various ways they did it, but one of the key ways that they did it was to lease out the landed estates that belonged to these noblemen. The noblemen mostly didn't want to be bothered running the estates. They just wanted the income from the estates. And they would go to Warsaw and spend it however they wanted. So Jewish money lenders would come in and they would lend the money, right? The price of the lease they would give to the nobleman. And then they would take control of the estate and run it for themselves, with the idea being that any profit they made above what they'd given to the nobleman, that would be their profit and that would be their income. So what happened was you have a series of very, very rich Jews leasing these huge estates from noblemen. And then these estates become Jewish run. They don't belong to the Jews, even though the Jew is actually in place of the nobleman. He's acting, even acting like a nobleman. But it's the Jew is running the show. And he did what Jews typically do, right? He broke up this huge estate into smaller units and brought in his family and friends to run those for him, right? And they brought in, that layer broke it down until you get down to individual taverns in which Jews would be put in by other Jews. It becomes a Jewish niche, the whole question of estates and taverns. Now, why are taverns important? Because those estates are geared to growing agricultural produce, particularly rye. Now, a lot of it goes to export, but what remains as import has to be sold on the home market. And one of the ways that the noblemen do it on their estates is because they have a monopoly on the creation, of the manufacture and sale of alcoholic drinks. Which is to say, if you are living on an estate, you can only buy a drink in a tavern owned by the nobleman, right? So there's a sitting market for alcoholic drinks, and the Jews are totally well aware of this, right? So that when they move into the taverns, they've created for themselves a really rich economic opportunity. And so eventually we have a situation where, particularly in the eastern regions of the Commonwealth, which is sort of Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, that kind of region, there are so many Jewish tavern keepers that the word Jew and the word tavern keeper, there's no difference between them. You can use them interchangeably. It turns out to be an incredibly profitable enterprise because that home market can be squeezed. Right? The nobleman would build more and more taverns and put more and more Jews in to sell. The marketing in the taverns became very intensive, right? And in some places, actually, there was a feudal obligation to drink a set amount of alcohol each week. And if you didn't, you had to buy it. If you drank it or not, that was your business. But the Polish peasants, who generally didn't have much else to do with their evenings, right? There's no TV and there's no internet. Right, and tomorrow is going to be just as horrible as today. So the best thing you can do is have a drink in the evening and feel a little bit better about life. And so this becomes a really important money spinning activity, and the Jews get more deeply and more deeply involved in it. Right, but it's part of a very particular relationship they have with the nobility, with the magnates and some of the lower nobility. And what will happen, we see with Glenn, is when that system sort of begins to change and break down, then the story begins to change and the attitudes change also. So perhaps I'll leave Glenn to take on.
Okay, and in transitioning, I'd like for you, Glenn, to talk a bit about the whole economic interchange, which Adam's just started speaking about, between the landowner, the tavern keeper, and the serf, the peasants who are purchasing. And I'm really fascinated by this notion that there were requirements on peasants to purchase a certain amount of liquor, and it sort of reminds me as a labor activist of the company store mentality.
Yeah. On the one hand, it's a ghastly enterprise, right? Compulsory drinking is really terrible to think about. On the other hand, it really, as Adam says, it was the mainstay of entertainment, of leisure time. And so, are Jews complicit in this system? Absolutely. But do they have many choices in the matter? Probably not, because, Jews can't own land. They have severe occupational restrictions. But let's be honest, it was lucrative, and it provided Jews with a relatively stable and prosperous existence. And that's really important to emphasize, because we have to understand, how did practically 3/4 of the world's Jewish population wind up in the Polish lands? We're accustomed to think of it as a kind of an anti-Semitic nightmare. Those who think in terms of the 20th century, where they're very, difficult and violent times. But for many centuries, this became really a fantastic place to live if you wanted to just be allowed to make a living, allowed to practice your various, religious requirements, customs, and that kind of thing. So it depends really on what I would describe as a symbiosis between Jews and the nobility and the peasantry. The peasantry, of course, getting the short end of the stick, but it really is a kind of a symbiosis. And so yes, it's a difficult kind of system when you think from a labor perspective, but you're also looking at a diaspora population trying to survive and finding that this, in comparison to Central and Western Europe, provides for a much more stable existence. And I think that's why you have Jews just pouring into the Polish lands like this and availing themselves of these opportunities. Adam's recent book, Rescue the Surviving Souls, talks about when that system breaks down in 1648, and there are widespread massacres throughout the Ukrainian lands. So you see how fraught the whole thing was, but usually the nobility was successful in protecting their Jewish lessees, who were also their best taxpayers and everything else. And so the system basically worked. One other thing I want to emphasize here, and that's the role of the tavern keeper. Jakub, if we could just put up my next slide, number 5, please. The figure of the Jewish tavern keeper really becomes an iconic figure. You know, if you know a little bit of Polish literature, the epic poem by Adam Mickiewicz, Pan Tadeusz, features Yankel, the tavern keeper, which became the title of my book. You know, this was accurate. You know, the Jewish tavern keeper was ubiquitous, was everywhere, and not just making money. He actually served a really crucial purpose, especially in the smaller towns and villages, the shtetl and villages. The Jewish tavern keeper was much more than a tavern keeper. He provided loans, advice, medical remedies, mediation. He could even write letters for you sometimes, and involved in matchmaking. It's unbelievable, just the diversity of pursuits. He's vital to local existence. And the tavern, of course, is much more than a tavern. You know, it's an entertainment venue, it's a restaurant, it's a store, it's supplies news and you know, all kinds of other services. So it's really such a vital center. So this is what I really want to emphasize is, yes, the feudal system is exploitative, to be sure, but there's a kind of balance of power that works out where Jews are able to benefit and have a decent life, you know, for several centuries.
So perhaps I can take that on slightly, because it was beautifully put. There's one thing about working for a nobleman, which the Jews knew from early on, and that is you had the backing of the supreme power on the land where you were. So if you were even a humble tavern keeper, you were working in the employ of the magnate, of the owner of the land, who was all powerful, certainly in 16th to 18th century, all powerful. And so you had backup. If things went wrong, if someone was breaking the monopoly or someone was even trying to be violent towards you, you could bring soldiers in, right, in order to get help. But on the whole, people didn't, because they knew the power structure. And these tavern keepers were part of this. They were very small cogs in a very big wheel, but this gave them a lot of stability until, as Glenn said, the system breaks down. Like in 1648, and there's another big uprising in 1740, when the peasants rebel against the magnates, against the nobles, and that's where their target is. But since it's the Jews who are serving them on the ground, the people who actually face the violence are the Jewish tavern keepers. So there's a lot of security. It's a very secure profession until, right, the system breaks down. And then the Jewish tavern keeper, as he is a single Jewish person or one family or possibly two families in a village, right, you can be very isolated, then you are in a very difficult place. But I think the best evidence for just how good this was for the Jews is just how many Jews took it on. And this could be 30% of the Jewish population in the 18th century, even in some places as much as 50% would be in the alcohol business. And so obviously it was you know, a good occupation. Worth saying that women were part of this as well. If Yakov can put up one of my slides. These were, to a very great extent, family business. It depends on the family, it depends on the husband, it depends on the wife. Now keep trying, Yakov. The one in color. That's it. This is a picture of a Jewish woman, but she's standing in front of a tavern. But the building behind her is clearly a tavern. And it is and yeah, she's a formidable character, right? You wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of her. That would not be a wise move. And I have evidence of that figure of the Jewish tavern keeper's wife as being particularly difficult with money and harsh. And obviously, she very often ran the show. And we know, for example, when husbands die, women very often continue to run the tavern as widows. It's very problematic in terms of Jewish law, but it happens. So that's also very important. It is actually a form of income that can involve the whole family, men and women. I just want to say one thing which I want to say from the tavern exhibit, in fact, and that is, as Glenn said, the tavern is the center of town. The tavern keeper knew everybody. Everybody knew him. You know, everything that was going on in the small town, in the shtetl or in the village, the tavern keeper knew, right? And he was basically quite friendly most of the time with the people around him. And we even have cases of tavern keepers and non-Jewish serving girls striking up various kinds of relationships. But there's one beautiful case which sort of illustrates just what a knife edge that was, and that comes from a small town called Rozdov. Not far from Sandomierz. And it's run by a Jewish tavern keeper called Shmuel Dubinsky. And in 1726, one of his friends, a guy called Franciszek Kowalski, comes in for a drink with his friends. They order a big jug of beer, I imagine, and they sit down to have a chat, and Shmuel joins them. And he appears to be drunk. Just to say, this is one of the cases where Jews actually could get drunk. And then they have this conversation, right? They talk about local politics, who's going to be the next mayor, right? Which are the good candidates, who should we be looking for? And then Shmuel, who is really obviously drunk, starts a conversation about religion. He says to his Christian friend, he says, "Our God is older than your Catholic God. Which God do you believe in?" He's already treading on very, very, and he answers, "The one who let himself be crucified for us." That's a good answer. And Shmuel is not satisfied with that. He says, "So you believe in that God which the potter put in the little roadside shrine you can see out of the window of the tavern?" And Franciszek says, "Yes, I believe in that God, because what you can see is an image of him, right? God himself is in heaven, right?" And then Shmuel the conversation really goes off the rails. He says, "Why did your God let himself be crucified if he's so powerful? And how come he's fallen over?" Presumably the thing had fallen over. At which point his friend, right, is really frightened and says, "Shmuel, don't talk like that. God is God. Just don't talk like that." And it's too late, because other people have overheard, and Shmuel is arrested and taken off to court for charges of blasphemy. But that story tells us a lot of things. It tells us about the relationship between Shmuel and Franciszek. They're friends. They can sit down and talk politics together. Shmuel is comfortable enough, right, that when he's drunk, he can talk about religion, right, which was, as I say, a crazy thing to do. It's the place where the news is being exchanged, who's going to be the next mayor, what's going on. It's the place of meeting and, of course, of tension. The people drinking there are aware that it is a Jewish person saying to them, and there is a religious divide that can't be bridged. So that gives a lovely picture of the microcosm, right, that was the tavern. And the tavern is minefield, right? As Glenn said, if the tavern keeper got drunk, it was not a good idea.
Well, I'd like to ask a question to expand on that, because many of us, when we envision the tavern, we wonder, was the tavern full of Jews and non-Jews? And for many of us watching, we have a very close connection to Fiddler on the Roof. And there's a very famous tavern scene where you have the Cossacks and you have the Jews, and they start off a little angry, they wind up celebrating. We're talking more about Poland and Lithuania here. How often were Jews welcome to actually drink in the taverns? How often did they have relationships beyond serving the drinks? And how often did violence happen around, anti-Jewish or just violence in general happen in the taverns in these time periods?
You want to say something, Glenn?
Yeah, sure. I mean, actually, it's funny. I've seen similar documents to what Adam described for the 19th century. So this was continuing. And look, there were cases of friendships and resulting in conversions sometimes, romantic relationships and conversion. Ellie Shanker has a book about this, Confessions from the Shtetl, which we'll put on our list. And this did happen. My sense, though, is it wasn't the norm. My sense is there really were divisions and social divisions. And I think the function of that, or the way of preserving those divisions, was the kind of myths and counter myths. The mutual suspicions. Jews can't be trusted. They're suspiciously sober. They're shrewd. They're going to cheat you. Gentiles are drunken and violent and not refined like we are. Bialik has an amazing poem about this. He grew up in his grandfather's tavern, and he talks about using all these liquid metaphors, the invectives spewing out of the customers' mouths as they fought each other and vomited. And meanwhile, he's clinging to his father, who's teaching him Torah, and the pure words of Torah are pouring out of his father's mouth. Sort of a contrast to this. These are, of course, just cultural stereotypes, but I think they really do serve the purpose of separation. And that's what I wanted to emphasize there. One major difference in the 19th century, though, that I really want to get in here, and that is that Poland is partitioned at the end of the 18th century between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And it's really wiped off the map until it reemerges as a semi-autonomous kingdom of Poland. Now, why is this important? With the partitions, you have tariffs. You have a very expensive grain export trade now that no longer makes sense in a lot of cases. So the nobility that owns the vast majority of the land is now going to turn even more of its grain into vodka to sell to the local peasants. And drunkenness becomes an even larger problem. And then it's accelerated by improvements in technology, the distilling techniques like the Pastorius machine. This is all like 1820s that this is happening. And you have widespread drunkenness is a vast problem. And of course, who's going to be blamed for it? Not the noblemen. The Jews who's serving is being blamed. That being said, the symbiosis throughout the 19th century basically holds. I have an amazing, Jakob, if you could show my next slide, I think it was number 6. I have just some amazing documents that attest to this. When this is a case where Jews have now been completely forbidden to sell liquor in the countryside. And the official statistics, which is why you always have to be careful of statistics, are claiming 0 Jewish-run taverns throughout the countryside. And, everyone knows it's an open secret. Jews are still running taverns and distilleries. Why? Because the nobility and the local Christian customers are protecting and concealing the Jewish tavern keeper. It's an amazing collusion that's going on. And that speaks to a kind of, I would say, inter-ethnic symbiosis as well. This is, in this case, the Tsarist authorities who find out that a Jew is running a tavern. In fact, several Jews are running several different taverns in the villages belonging to this one nobleman. And at the end of the case, the local Christians get together, and on the right, you can kind of see it. They sign a petition swearing that this local Jew, whose name is Zelka, is not a tavern keeper, does not sell liquor, and it just runs a dry restaurant. So they're basically, they're lying on his behalf, and they offer even a bribe to the local police court to attest to their honesty. It's just an amazing phenomenon that you go from having that Jewish-Polish relationship to a more triangular relationship between Jews, local Christian Poles, and then, in this case, Tsarist authorities. And, the local Christians resent Tsarist authorities from interfering with their profits, and with their local traditional way of life. So they will protect and preserve and conceal their local Jewish tavern keepers in an amazing way, often serving as fronts for the taverns. That's a very common way to have a Christian front. And this is all going on really almost under the noses of the czarist authorities. And one last thing I want to say about this, these villages are less than 10 miles from the small town of Yadvadna, which is the infamous site of during the Holocaust in 1941, July 10th, 1941, when locals turn on their Jewish neighbors and there's a horrible massacre and everything. So think about how much has changed, from this system of covering for your local Jewish neighbors to situations of violence. It's in pretty much the same locale. So the 20th century really does represent a major change in Jewish-Christian relations in these areas.
So maybe if you have a few final pieces before we take some questions.
One very quick point
Sure.
To add to what Glenn said, and that is, it also Jews going to taverns depends where you are. In a small town, in a shtetl, where you can have half of the population even more Jewish, and everyone lives in an integrated way, then clearly the Jews and the Christians went to the same taverns and mingled in the taverns. What Glenn was saying is absolutely right. Is this mingling of, on one hand, symbiosis, and on the other side, deep religious hate. And they're acting at the same time. It's not this or that. It's both at the same time. And that is a real significant part, I think, of the Polish Jewish experience, and ties in exactly to what Glenn was saying about Jedwabne, right? The things at the same time. And although in the 20th century, the balance is swayed, as he said, towards violence. I'm sorry, that's it.
And if I could just add one
Sure.
quick thing, what really changes things for me, what I see is emancipation of the peasantry, where it's a wonderful thing the peasants are emancipated, but now they're on a collision course economically with Jews. They want to run taverns too. So this starts this real inter-ethnic tension, competition. Meanwhile, the nobility is becoming increasingly indebted and impoverished, and they're pushing the competition with Jews. So by the end of the 19th century, this system really breaks down. That's just what I wanted to emphasize.
And one more, just small addition. In my conversations with both of you previously, you mentioned the tavern as a place that Jews who were traveling could find rest in a kosher meal. So there was that part of them too, correct?
Oh yes, absolutely. It seems that, and Adam, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that these taverns were kosher restaurants, as far as I can tell.
I'm not. Yeah, absolutely. They would have been able to serve kosher food to Jewish clients. The descriptions, however, we have of most of these taverns are of these foul, dirty, smelly, falling down, ramshackle places, right? And people are sharing beds with each other. It sounds like a really horrible experience to stay there. But it was run by a Jewish person, so the food would have been kosher. Although some actually are reported to have kept pigs. So you do have tavern keepers keeping pigs. So maybe not all the food was kosher, who can say?
Okay, well, I'll give both of you a chance to give some final remarks, but right now let's look at some of the questions we have. There's a question, there's some comments about the occupations of Jews during these periods that what both of you were talking. I'm looking at Jeff Kelman's question. What sort of other occupations were available to Jews during this era? Was it more that tavern keeping was just highly profitable and thus was an incentive to enter, or was it really the only option for many Jews?
No, it wasn't the only option. The Jews were always very, very big in trade, buying and selling. In the small towns, they could do it in place. Otherwise, they were very big in regional trade. We also have lots and lots of Jewish craftsmen, particularly tailors for shatnez, and you have kosher slaughterers and so on. So there are plenty of options, I think. Glenn?
Yeah, and just to add, by the end of the 19th century, because of the competition from Christians, increasing competition, and the end of the noble liquor monopoly, you do have a diversification of Jewish trades, even more so than what Adam was talking about, mainly towards, I would say, trade and crafts, just increased variety. But it's hard to tell because these taverns are underground, right? They're clandestine. So we could be misled by these official reflections of official data very easily. So, for example, there aren't supposed to be any more Jewish tavern keepers by the 20th century. It's outlawed. And used to have historians telling genealogists that's impossible. There's no way your grandfather ran a tavern. It's just impossible. They weren't allowed. And I since found that actually not being allowed to do something is almost irrelevant in the case of
Jews ever, not ever, to do something.
Right, and so there's a huge flourishing underground liquor trade. It's very hard to really measure.
Mm-hmm. And I'll sort of segue into a question from Martin Freeman, which is, were the Jews who ran taverns generally wealthier, even much wealthier than the rest of the Jewish community?
Well, Adam, you should probably answer this for the early modern period, but I think it's
Yeah.
probably the same, and that is there's a tremendous variety. You could become actually quite wealthy doing this, although in my period of time, when it's more clandestine, you could be ruined very easily by somebody informing on you.
Yeah, I described it kind of as a pyramid, right? You have the Jew at the top of the lease and leasing. The lower down you were on the pyramid, the poorer you were, and the more difficult your life was. So it really depends who, where, what, and when. There were very poor tavern keepers, and there were some very rich tavern keepers.
Yeah.
So I see some questions that really speak to my hobby and an interest I have, which is, could you speak to the production of beer or spirits, either as part of tavern keeping or separate? And that's Mark Schilling. And then someone right under him, I think it's JYV79, speaks about flavoring of neutral spirits. And behind me, what you'll see is a collection of really Jewish infused spirits, from Shlivovitz, which is one of my favorites to say, to apricot. And for example, there's a honey liqueur that when you go to Poland, you see, it's called Krupnik. And I happen to know a number of families named Krupnik. So could you speak a little bit to the manufacture of spirits?
Adam, do you have anything?
Okay. Yeah. So in my period, manufacture of spirits was part of the noble monopoly, and so the Jews ran it. Sometimes they ran it beside the tavern, and sometimes they would take it as an urban occupation. We know this because there were all kinds of problems involved in manufacturing that should have run into Shabbat and couldn't run into Shabbat. So the rabbis are legislating how you brew beer on Shabbat and how you distill vodka on Shabbat. So we know that the Jews did it. And it was part of making a profit because it was cheaper that way. About flavoring, I know the Jews made mead, which is honey beer. I'm not sure how most of the tavern keepers would have got hold of what they needed to do the flavoring that you're talking about. But that's just ignorance on my part. I just haven't come across the materials.
Yeah, I'm getting the sense that the fancier infused drinks were reserved for the nobility. That's what I've seen in my accounts. This is 19th century. And so you even have a separate room often for the nobility to drink in. And everyone else is getting the cheapest, harshest, kerosene-like substance you can imagine, because you just want to make it as much as you can, as cheaply as possible. And it's not something you would want to drink, for the most part. By the way, one last thing, and that is beer, by my period, by the 19th century, has been almost completely displaced by vodka. So it's just because vodka gets you there a lot faster. It's also cheaper. The potato has an impact as well. You can grow a lot more potatoes on the same plot of land, but then you have the potato famine that puts an end to that relatively quickly. But yes, very cheap vodka for most people. And your kind of drinks were reserved only for the elite of the elite.
Very interesting, as the CEO of the Workers' Circle, a socialist and Bundist founded organization, but I do share my liquor widely. So Adam and Glenn, first of all, thank you. And is there any final words you want to speak to on this eve of shortly before Purim about Jews and liquor?
I would just say that liquor and taverns and distilleries run leased by Jews from the nobility were really central to this kind of symbiotic relationship that existed, which explains why so many Jews lived in the Polish lands. And we should be trying not to read history backwards, through the prism of the Holocaust as much as we can, and the prism of pogroms, and understand that this at one time was a really thriving, prosperous, and stable Jewish community. And that I think is what makes it, for me, so interesting.
Adam.
I wanted to mention, I actually found not long ago, came across a song in Yiddish, which appears to be a Purim song. And it's about Jewish women drinking in taverns, right? And that's like in the branch bill, they're sitting around, they're being rude about their husbands, they're drinking. One gets so drunk that she can't afford to pay her bar bill, and so she has to leave her skirt behind, right, in lieu of payment, and then goes home, right, without a skirt on. And her husband tries to tell her off, but she tells him off so strongly in the end, he ends up saying, "Yes, dear," right? So this is clearly a Purim song, right? It's a Purim song about an upside down reality, but the reality of Jews drinking and Jewish women drinking and Jews running taverns is absolutely part of everyday life for Jewish society for hundreds of years. And although we love to think of all our ancestors as being pious rabbis, a lot of them were tavern keepers.
That's a wonderful, I think, final piece. And I encourage everyone who's watching to start asking some of the people you know, or ask your own relatives if there's perhaps a tavern keeper in your history. And what I've been finding is more often than not, the answer is yes. And it's a wonderful opening to our Jewish life and our heritage and our rich culture. So with that, let me thank both of you, and thank again Toby for creating the facility for us to do this. And I'm thrilled, Adam, that you have debuted in this program, and we look forward to seeing more of you. And I'll turn it back to Halise for the final word.
And thank you for curating our amazing conversation. And thank you, Adam and Glenn, for sharing your time, scholarship, insights, your humor. It's been quite a special opportunity for all of us. I'd like to also thank our team, Jakub Wyszek and Kaya Shicek. Thank you all for spending this hour with us. We know it's pre-Purim, and we appreciate your time and your joining us, all of your comments. Please let us know if there are subjects that you'd like us to address. And also, we invite you to support us. You, as our viewing audience, are those who make this happen. And if you'd like some information about how to support Toby Jewish Center and TJHT Talks, it will come in an email following this podcast. So we wish you a Freilichen Purim, a happy Purim. Please stay well and safe. And again, thank you for joining us. Good night, good day, and be well.
Thanks.